Thanks for coming to, we're recording, got it. Can everyone see my screen all right?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. How about now?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, well, my name is Zach Whitener. A lot of people that knew me growing up called me Bowie as well. And I'm a research associate and the vessel safety officer at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got into science and some of the work that I do here. All right. So who am I and how did I get here? First and foremost, from a very, very young age, I've been a fisherman. So here's a picture of me with my Long Island gear on, with a bucket of lobsters, just the size of me. And ever since I was a little kid, I've been interested in the ocean and fishing. And at first it was all about lobsters. As I slowly got bigger, I got on bigger boats and started to catch bigger lobsters. But my excitement for lobsters and sea creatures really hasn't gone away. Since then, in addition to being a lobsterman, I've also been a fisherman too, where I catch striped bass. That's what that is. I'm holding in my hands there, caught in Portland Harbor. And so I grew up commercial lobstering, and I still have a commercial lobster license in addition to being a scientist. And I also am a Maine guide, and I take people out striper fishing and help people catch fish around here. So I grew up on Long Island. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right here in the middle of Casco Bay. If we were in person at GMRI, we would be over here, or this blue X is in Portland. So Long Island is a 45-minute ferry ride from Portland. That's about, 3 miles or so away. And right now I'm in Freeport, which is up here a little bit. So the closest X I could give you was the mouth of the Royal River. And so this is where I spend all my time working and playing in Casco Bay. So how did I get to be a scientist though? Well, it started out with wanting to catch more lobsters. I'm trying to figure out why there were more lobsters on these traps versus those traps. And so I wanted to learn more about why different lobsters and fish are in different places. So when I was in college, I went to Brown University. And when I got an internship, it was with the Cape Cod Commercial Hook Fishermen's Association. So that was a group of fishermen out of Cape Cod, which is south from Portland, quite a ways in Massachusetts, where I worked as a fisheries observer. So that meant that I would go out on commercial fishing boats, most of the time gill netters. As you can see, a gill net catching a shark, a dogfish in the bottom right here. And I would record the things that the fishermen caught and to look at the numbers, what they were keeping, what they were throwing back, better so that way they could have better management of their fishery. They could go back to the fisheries managers and say what they were actually catching, what they're letting go. And so I did a lot of work in the southern Gulf of Maine, so east of Cape Cod and around George's Bank and out here. I did a couple trips offshore, way offshore, about 100 miles offshore for monkfish. And so that was really my first foray into academic science, really, working for them, in addition to having grown up as a fisherman. So after college, my first job at GMRI, I was an intern and then a research technician where I was working on river herring. And so specifically alewives. This is an alewife here in the bottom left. They're little herring that act like salmon. And by that, I mean they're anadromous, which means they live in salt water until they become adults, and they swim up into fresh water, and they swim up into rivers and ponds to spawn. And the juvenile herring, when they're about an inch or so long, they swim back downstream to live in the ocean. So you can catch them in fishways like I'm doing here. And I was doing work on their otoliths, which are their ear bones. I'll tell you a lot more about otoliths in a little bit. From there, I decided I needed more education, and I got a master's in science degree from the University of the Virgin Islands, where I got a degree in marine and environmental sciences. The Virgin Islands are quite a ways away from the Gulf of Maine, but that was a big part of why I wanted to go there. I had spent all of my fishing life and science life in the Northeast, and I wanted to go to a different ecosystem to learn about science, marine science, in a completely different place, to have new ideas and fresh approaches. So I was living on St. Thomas, which is one of the US Virgin Islands. And I was doing a lot of work around St. Thomas and St. John, and this is the shelf edge. All along here, it's basically like the continental shelf, where it goes from about 100 feet deep to about 6,000 feet deep here. So there's a lot of currents that happen on the edges here that bring together all sorts of animal life. This is the view from the dock at UVI, looking out the back door of the place where I took all my classes. And what I was doing most of the work on were these guys, these little shrimp. And so I was doing a lot of work on reefs and doing a lot of scuba diving and figuring out why there were more little shrimp on this reef and more little crabs on that reef. And so I had a lot of fun catching these guys with little traps that I built, and it was a lot of fun. Of course, and it was also a lot of work. So when I wasn't working, but also still having fun, I was, of course, catching fish too. I've always been a fisherman, and it's something that I've always loved. And so this is a tarpon that I caught in the Virgin Islands. So after that, after I got my master's degree, I came back to GMRI, where I got a job as a research associate. And so I started to work on river herring again, on alewives, on Atlantic cod. I did work for a lot of years on cod. I'm doing striper work now a little bit, but I'm going to tell you about more today. And now most of my work is with bluefin tuna. And so this is a tuna caught just off of Portland. And this is one of my colleagues, Walt Goet, standing next to it. If you've ever met Walt, you'll know he's not a very big guy, but still, it's a big fish. My other role at GMRI is I'm a captain. So I am the vessel safety officer is my official term for that job, which means that I'm the captain for most of our research voyages. And I make sure that we are safe and everything is up to par and we do everything by the books. Of course, though, saying the word captain, it makes it sound more special than it always is. This is the time of year when I get to have all the fun, and I also get to do all the maintenance on the boats. And so here I am painting the bottom of that boat. So if I do a lot of work in the springtime, getting dirty, and in the summertime, I get to play on the boat. So, you know, it's two very important parts of the job. As a scientist and captain, I help design a lot of our research projects that we do on our boats. And so one of them is where we go out at night and do surveys using basically fancy fish finders to count where there's fish in the ocean, generally spawning herring, or if there's pogies offshore or squid or anything like that. So this is just a fun cartoon of the kind of other work that we do. But what today I'm going to tell you about, I was going to tell you a lot about striped bass. And so a lot of the work I do across multiple species is what's called stock identification. So stock identification is learning about and identifying which different populations fish come from within the same species. So by that, I mean, with striped bass, we're learning about where they come from and the ones that we catch in Maine. So this is a picture of my boat where sometimes we can catch a lot of fish at once. You got 3 rods bent. This is my wife, Sarah. She loves to fish with me too. Everyone cares about stripers, but we always want to learn more about them. So where do stripers live? Mostly on the East Coast, the United States. This really ugly color, brownish orange, is the native range of striped bass. There's also another population in the Gulf of Mexico. There's also another population in Canada. And then all this red is where striped bass have been introduced all around the country. So there are different populations where usually for the most part, the fish on the east coast of the US are one population. And then in Canada, there are a couple of different ones from the Bay of Fundy population and then the Gulf of St. Lawrence population that don't mix generally with our East Coast US fish. Excuse me. So the core question for our project, which is called Snap a Striper, is where do our fish come from? Most striped bass that we catch in Maine are migratory fish. Most of the striped bass on the East Coast spawn in the Chesapeake Bay, the Delaware River, or Hudson River. And just like I was talking about with alewives earlier and salmon, stripers are also anadromous. So they spawn and make juvenile stripers in these rivers. And the juveniles, when they get big enough, they come out of the rivers and join the coastal migration. And so every year, fish from the mid-Atlantic, from New Jersey, Maryland, etc., New York, they swim up to New England for the summer to feed, to eat herring, to eat everything they can get their mouths on. And then in the fall, they come back down south into the winter. And then in the spring, they go back up when they're old enough adults, generally more than 5 or 6 years old, that they return to their natal rivers. So the river in which they were hatched themselves, they return there to spawn, to start the cycle all over again. However, we know that not all of them that we catch in Maine are from down south. And how do we know that? Well, because there's a breeding population in Maine, in the Kennebec River. Most of the major rivers on the East Coast used to have their own striper populations. So every river had their own populations that would join this giant coastwide migration. Unfortunately, with overfishing about 100 years ago, most of these populations were extirpated, which means they're locally extinct. And so the Kennebec population died out around the 1890s. In the 1970s, the Maine Department of Marine Resources got juvenile, so young of the year fish from the Hudson River, got a couple 100,000 of them, and let them go in the Kennebec River. And so that restarted our population, because the juvenile fish that ended up growing up in the Kennebec River, when they became mature, they would return to the Kennebec River to spawn there themselves. There's also a question of if some of the spawning populations from the Bay of Fundy, so there's a couple rivers here that also have populations of stripers, do those ever join the Gulf of Maine fish? We don't know. But when you catch little fish like this, it's hard to imagine that some of these fish that are only 2 years old have really come all the way from the Chesapeake Bay in a few short months. And so we think that there are definitely local fish spawning around here that we catch in our fishery. So this is a satellite image of the mouth of the Kennebec River. This is Merrymeeting Bay. If you've ever been around there, this is where striped bass spawn in Maine. Interestingly, some of the fish don't swim south in the winter, especially in the Kennebec River, Connecticut River, Hudson River. The fish overwinter in the rivers. And so some people will actually catch striped bass when they're trying to fish for smelt. If any of you have fished for smelt through the ice, they're usually about this big. And imagine your surprise if you caught a striper that was this big. So it's a once in a lifetime fish when people happen to catch them, but they're there. So the big question is, where do they come from? My dog thinks she can smell where they come from. Unfortunately, she's not very good at explaining that to me, so we have to figure out other ways to do it. So recreational fishermen from the Coastal Conservation Association approached Jim or I about 8 years ago, to say, hey, we've got special regulations on the Kennebec River that protects these spawning fish, but how important actually are those regulations? We want to find out where our fish that we catch come from. So it's really important, this citizen science program, where we have anyone who wants to volunteer to help us out, participate, that they wanted to collect data in a way that wouldn't hurt the fish. And so usually in fisheries science, we end up collaborating with commercial fishermen and having fish that have been harvested, i.e. killed, and then we do a lot of research on them from their bodies. So one of the main things about this project that makes it special is that most of the data comes from catch and release fish. The way we do that is we get a photo of the fish, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. And then if people do harvest the fish, so if they take one home for supper, we also have them save the head for us to get those ear bones, the otoliths, that I'll get into in a minute. So we have fishermen take a picture of their catch like this, and they have this data card we provide them. This card is about 4 inches long. So we can use the card for scale to know how big the fish is by measuring the card. We also get the date and the location for the fish was caught. So we then do what's called morphometrics on the fish. So we do a box truss analysis. So we, on the computer program, we do image analysis, it's called, where we click on landmarks on the fish. So where fins begin and end, gill plates, things like that. And then it makes 27 measurements all along here to describe the shape of the fish statistically. Differences in body shape can be used to identify fish from different populations that have a different life history. So by life history, we mean what that, in this case, what that fish's migration patterns are like. So when a fish swims all the way from the Chesapeake Bay to Maine, all the way back down to Chesapeake Bay in a single season, those fish tend to be what we call torpedoes. Those are long and skinny fish. Basketballs are fish that don't swim as far. So they might spend their winter in the Kennebec River, come out in the Gulf of Maine for the summer to eat some things, and then go back in the river. And so even though their genetics might be the same, the actual lived life history of the fish, depending on how much they're migrating, can affect some of the shape of the fish. And so that's one way we're describing the different populations of fish we might be seeing. We also use their otoliths, like I've said a few times before. The otoliths, this is a striped bass otolith right here on the left, from a striped bass that's, say, oh, I don't know, 2 feet long. The otolith is about the size of my thumbnail. And the otolith is just like how you have ear bones in your ears that help you with balance and hearing things and orientation. They also do that with a fish. But interestingly, they also grow rings just like a tree, so you can age the fish. And they also incorporate some of the water chemistry that the fish are swimming in. So we can look at the otoliths, look at their chemical signatures, kind of like barcodes, and to look back in time where the fish came from. How do we get these otoliths? Well, let me see if I can bring this up for you. Can you, let's see, is that showing yet? Uh-oh.
It's just a white screen at the moment. Oh, wait, now it's loading. All right, so it doesn't look like you have sound if we're supposed to.
Yeah, you don't need the sound. So that's a saw cutting off the top of the fish's head. And then you can see this fish has been filleted for its meat already. And then you wash out the otoliths. Now he's gonna have some forceps and tweezers to pull these out. And there's 1 and 2. All right, so that's how we get the otoliths out. New share, I'm gonna bring us back to, let's see. No, let's see, how do I get back?
You might just have to close share and then reshare.
Okay. How about that?
Looks good. It's in your presenter notes form though.
Oops. What's it showing right now?
It's showing the presenter notes, so it's like showing next slide and all that too.
All right. Well, give me 1 second here. Aha. That should be it.
Perfect.
How's that? All right. And so we take out those otoliths and we take what's called a section. So we cut them with a saw in half. So we can see here, this is the otolith, this is the core, so the oldest part of the fish. And these are the tree rings like that I'm talking about, these bands of light and dark. So you can see dark, or it's white colored, then dark, white, dark. So these bands are the ages of the fish. So this fish right here is a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, probably a 5-year-old fish if we count the outside. So what we do is we then take a micro mill, which is basically think of the drill in a dentist office, and drill out the middle of the otolith with a computer controlled drill to get the core. And so we pulverize the center of the otolith, again, which I said is the oldest part of the fish, and look at the water chemistry from there. And that can show us, usually from temperature and salinity, the chemistry is different from different rivers. And so we can have an educated guess about which river this fish spent its first year in life in, even though it's a 5-year-old fish. So it's a really cool technique to look back in time to where the fish was as a juvenile. So what can the pictures and otoliths tell us? The morphometric separation isn't great. So the body shape, you can see these overlining, they look like shotgun blasts kind of overlapping, and it's so there's some differences with fish caught in the Kennebec River are separated a little bit from the other fish, but it's not great. We found definitely better information from the otoliths so far, where even though our samples of fish were only about 10% from the Kennebec River, from the actual where they're actually caught, the data, the otolith data makes it look like almost 1/3 of our fish actually from the Kennebec. So that's pretty cool initial results. But where do we go from here is we need more samples. And so getting people involved, whether they are new at fishing or have been doing it their whole lives, more people interested in fish and helping with our research is always what we're looking for. And so if you're interested in helping out with Snapper Striper, you can email me. I'm sure anyone can give you my email address, how to get involved. And yeah, so we're always looking for more pictures and more heads of fish. If anyone harvests fish, we might be adding another component this year, which is collecting some scales. So that way we can do chemistry work on the fish without them having to be harvested. So caught and release fish, you can take a couple scales from. So yeah, that's where things are going with that project. And let me know if you have any questions. This is one of the coolest things I caught when I was in graduate school. When I was working on those little shrimp traps, I catch other things. And so this is a brittle star that I just think has the cutest little almost smiley face on it. So anyway, yeah, let me know if you have questions.
So I do have a few questions from our guests. So the first one is a nice, easy one. One of the students wants to know if your dog is a toddler.
She sure is. Yep, she's a Nova Scotia duck-thong retriever.
Ah, there you go.
And the first time that she met a striped bass, she had been sleeping on the boat. She didn't pay attention to the first couple fish. And finally she got up and I held up a fish for her and she sniffed it, then she licked it, and then she quickly tried to bite it, but bit it right on one of the spines and quickly learned her lesson and has never bitten a striped bass since. So the fish was unharmed and the dog learned her lesson. So
fair enough. That'd be a tough lesson to learn. So another person wants to know where you caught that brittle sea star.
That was on the west coast of St. Thomas. And so a place called Flat Key, which is by the airport.
Okay, cool.
So in the Caribbean.
Yeah. Okay, so you have a couple questions about when you first started fishing. So one student wants to know how you first decided to be a fisherman, and another wants to know if you thought it was kind of scary whenever you started or not.
So the first time I think the first time I ever fished, my mother took me, and we were catching little panfish using hot dog skins for bait. And so she was great and would take me fishing after school. And then when I got a little bit older, we moved to Long Island and Casco Bay, where we could fish off the dock all the time, which is great, and fish for mackerel and things like that. And then I became a lobsterman because that's what everyone does there. There are many lobster boats, and I started lobstering when I was in, I think it was 4th or 5th grade, because that's what everyone did. And it's a wonderful place to grow up because you get to have those experiences. I think that one of the most fun things about fishing or lobstering is it's always a surprise. You never know what you're going to catch. You feel that tug on the line and you don't know who it's going to be when you reel it in. Or the lobster trap, it's like opening a Christmas present, every time you haul one up. Who knows if you're going to catch lobsters or crabs or fish or anything else. So I always found it very exciting.
Yeah, it's like opening a present.
That's right.
So I have a couple questions about that starfish. One wants to know how big was it, like compared to your hand, maybe? And the other one is curious about why it looks the way it does as compared to other sea stars.
So that one was kind of a bigger one. It was about the size of my palm, so it was maybe 3.5 to 4 inches across. And in the Caribbean, there's a lot of species diversity. So compared to in the temperate, so cooler systems, ecosystems like we have in Maine, we don't have a whole lot of species diversity in Maine, but we have a whole lot of whatever species there are here in terms of population numbers. So, for example, we don't have a whole lot of types of fish here, but there are a lot of pollock. There are a lot of mackerel, as opposed to in the Caribbean, tropical ecosystems like that have a much greater species diversity, so numbers of different species, but far fewer of each one. And so when I was doing that project, I must have caught somewhere between 12 and 15 different species of brittle stars. And so they all have different reasons for why they live and look the way they do to fit in ecological niches. And so, some reefs are more yellow coral than red. And so the yellow brittle stars that do better there because it's better camouflage than the red ones. Whereas in Maine, I think we only have 2 species of brittle stars. I think they're not very common here, but the ones that we do have, again, there's a lot more. It's common to find a lot more of them when you do, and numbers wise, than in the Caribbean, you might find one that's banded yellow like that. So,
Cool. We have a few questions about sizes. So, what is the largest black sea bass striper you've caught, and what is the largest lobster you've caught?
Let's see. So one of the fun things about being a fishing guide is that you can claim all the fish that other people caught on your boat were ones that you caught, because they wouldn't have caught them without you. And so the biggest one that we've had on the boat was last summer, and it was about 44 inches. So it was almost 4 feet long. It was a very big fish. And biggest lobster, again, I'm going to go off of someone else's boat that I was on. You always catch the biggest lobsters gill netting because the biggest lobsters can't fit in lobster traps. And so, off of Chatham, we get a run of giant migratory lobsters that move with the seasons, and we caught a couple that were over 20 pounds. Interestingly, the very biggest lobsters that you'll ever catch in a lobster trap, generally speaking, are always female lobsters, because inshore it's the bigger ones, because the rules that we have and the laws we have that protect breeding lobsters, or they get V-notch, the breeding lobsters. So then the females, a lot of times the productive females get protected. So inshore here, the biggest lobsters are always females. Offshore, when you catch gigantic lobsters, the absolute biggest ones are always males. And they're ones that don't fit in a lobster trap.
It's pretty cool. I wouldn't have guessed that. We had a couple questions earlier about like catching fish, like why is some bait better than others?
Well, a lot of times I think that some bait is more oily than others, so the smell carries a lot further in the water. It's also really important that your bait doesn't fall apart. So you can have a really oily fish, but as soon as your hook hits the water, it falls apart. That's not going to help you very much. So it might attract things, but won't help you catch them. So for striped bass, my favorite are to use either live alewives or river herring for bait, or pollock. But I also fly fish a lot too. And that makes no sense at all, because you're using fur or hair or feathers. And that's what's so fun about it, is that there's no good reason why a fish would want to eat that. And so it's really on you to manipulate it, so make it swim right to look enticing to a predatory fish. And so, if you have the right bait, anyone can catch a fish. But if you want to make it more difficult, you try it more difficult ways. So
I like that. So we had another question about changing populations in Maine. So they are wondering why we're having species like the Portuguese man-o-war that are coming closer to places like Maine.
Well, if you have listened to the news recently, this year, 2021, was the warmest year that's ever been recorded in the Gulf of Maine. So the Gulf of Maine is getting warmer, and there's a couple reasons for that. There's changes in ocean currents. So things that like jellyfish and jellies, Portuguese man-o-wars, etc., that just drift with the currents, they are definitely subject to how currents change to bring them places. But then even things like fish that can decide where they want to swim are definitely very affected by water temperature. And so the Gulf of Maine is getting warmer than it has been in the past. And that's going to have, it already is having big effects on the animal life that lives here. You think about how much we notice if it's a few degrees warmer or colder in your room. Imagine being in water where those differences are really, really strong. 1 degree water temperature is a huge difference compared to 1 degree air temperature. And so these fish and creatures that live in the ocean really are affected by these water temperatures much more than we can really understand or appreciate.
Yeah. So going back to otoliths, what is the oldest fish you've ever caught?
Well, I think the oldest one, I think the oldest fish I've ever identified where I was looking at the otoliths was probably a lake trout. So the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife came to us a few years ago wanting to start to age the lake trout and the togue that they catch out of Sebago Lake for better management. And looking at some of those togue, I could count them out to 20, 25 years old. Also, some of the tuna that we catch I think the oldest one we've aged was 23 years old. Um, most of the fish, most of the aging that I've done is with alewives, which only live 3 or 4 years, cod, which used to live a lot longer, but more commonly they're about 4 years old. Um, so, but I've caught a number of redfish, so I don't have any pictures of them here, but redfish are really slow growing. And so probably the oldest fish I've caught were probably redfish that I didn't age, but if I had to guess.
Cool, thank you. So I have a question about pets. So one student wants to know if you've ever had a shrimp as a pet. I think they're thinking of like the little sea monkeys.
Hmm. I have not. No. One time I tried to have we call them conkles. They're they're I don't know what the official common name is, if they're waved, I think waved whelk, but they're about 2 inches long, like giant periwinkles. You'd find at low tide sometimes, or if you have a lobster trap baited with crabs, you'll catch a ton of conkles. So one time I brought some of those home and I put them in a fish tank, a saltwater tank, and my mother thought it was kind of fun to see him, you know, crawl around the bottom. Well, it wasn't fun in the morning when they'd all crawled out over the top of the tank and were on the floor, and I've been on the floor for overnight and they were quite stinky. So I learned my lesson about having mollusks or snails in the house.
Fair enough. I think I would have learned my lesson just from hearing that story. Have you ever caught a shark? And or what is the coolest thing you've ever caught?
Yeah, I've definitely caught sharks. Catch dogfish a lot is common when you're ground fishing, but also we do some shark tagging and things. We have to catch sharks for that. So we oftentimes you catch blue sharks. And so blue sharks are blue, and they're about the ones that we caught last summer were all 7 or 8 feet long. So we caught those probably 10 miles off of Portland. Coolest thing, oh geez. That's a tough one. I'd have to think about that one for a while. But I like catching tarpon. Tarpon are fun.
Yeah. I have a request to see that starfish picture again, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And another kid wants to know if you caught a lungfish before.
No, I have not.
Oh, all right.
There it is.
There we go. That's such a cute little face. Oh, another student asked if it was pokey, like to the touch. Like, is it spiny?
No, because the spines are so small. So it's definitely, you can feel the little ridges on it, but they're not big enough to or long enough to really be able to poke you.
That's comforting. How long was that bluefin tuna you showed earlier with Walt?
So legal size, legal size for bluefin tuna for commercially harvested fish in the Gulf of Maine is 73 inches. So that's very big to begin with. So generally, a 73-inch fish is probably 300 to 400 pounds, probably 300 pounds. And so this one, the biggest one we've ever sampled was, I think, 121 inches. And so this one was not the biggest one. This one was probably maybe 115 inches. So just about 10 feet long. And this is probably a 700-pound fish.
Wow, that is a big fish. What is your favorite part in general about going fishing?
Oh, I like to be outside. I like to be outside. I like to go for boat rides. And one of the big things about fishing with me is it's I think of it almost like a mathematical equation. So by that, I mean, there's a lot of variables that go into it. So I have to think about, especially if someone's paying me to help them catch fish, it's really important that I catch fish when I'm guiding. Um, so I think about it. So what's the tide today? Is the tide coming or going? What's the weather? What's the water temperature? And I think about all these factors and how they come together and think, okay, we have 4 hours to help these people catch fish. Where are we going to go first? Okay, this isn't working. What's wrong? Well, which one of these variables have I not thought about correctly? Then we go someplace else. And then, so it's trial and error, and it's really trying to figure out the distribution of animals that by definition are they're quite random. You know, there's a reason why they're everywhere, but we don't know all those reasons. So it's really fun to try to figure out the mental aspect of it, of where should we start? Where should we go from there? So.
I like that. So for our final question, where is your favorite place to go fishing?
Oh, around Long Island. Yeah, around here for sure. I grew up lobstering around Long Island. I started with a rowboat and then slowly got bigger boats. And so I know all the rocks and all the ledges and all the little sand patches around the island very, very well. But the experience has been from a lobstering perspective. And so it's really fun to go out there now as I've gotten much bigger into striped bass fishing in the last 10 years to go and fish all these places that I know so well from a lobstering perspective, and just do something different and fun. So.
I like that. Keeping it home.
Yeah.
So I'm going to end the recording now.